Chapter 2 The Marketplace. The grass plot before the jail in Prison Lane on a certain summer morning not less than 2 centuries ago was occupied by a pretty large number of inhabitants of Boston, all with their eyes intently fastened on the iron-clamped oaken door. Amongst any other population, or at a later period in the history of New England, the grim rigidity of the petrified, the bearded physiognomies of these good people would have argued some awful business in hand. It could have betokened nothing short of the anticipated execution of some rioted culprit, on whom the sentence of legal tribunal had but confirmed the verdict of public sentiment. But in that early severity of the Puritan character, an inference of this kind could not so indubitably be drawn. It might be that the sluggish bond-servant or an undutiful child whom his parents had given over to the civil authority was to be corrected at the whipping-post. It might be that the antinomian, a Quaker, or other heterodox religious, was to be scourged out of the town, or an ideal or vagrant Indian, whom a white man's firewater had made riotous about the streets, was to be driven with the stripes into the shadow of the forest. It might be, too, that a witch, like old Mistress Hibbins, the bitter-tempered widow of the magistrate, was to die upon the gallows. In either case, there was very much the same solemnity of demeanor on the part of the spectators, as befitted a people amongst whom religion and law were almost identical, and in whose character both were so thoroughly interfused that the mildest and severest acts of public discipline were alike made venerable and awful. Meagre, indeed, and cold was the sympathy that a transgressor might look for from such bystanders at the scaffold. On the other hand, a penalty which in our days would infer a degree of mocking, infamy, and ridicule might then be invested with almost as stern a dignity as the punishment of death itself. It was a circumstance to be noted, on the summer morning when our story begins its course, that the woman, of whom there were several in the crowd, appeared to take a peculiar interest in whatever penal infliction might be expected to ensue. The age had not so much refinement that any sense of impropriety restrained the wearers of the petticoat and farthingale from stepping forth into the public ways and wedging their not so unsubstantial persons, if occasion were, into the throng nearest to the scaffold at an execution. Morally as well as materially, there was a coarser fibre in those wives and maidens of old English birth and breeding than in their fair descendants, separated from them by a series of 6 or 7 generations, for throughout that chain of ancestry every successive mother has transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and a slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than her own. The women who were now standing about the prison door stood within less than half a century of the period within the man-like Elizabeth had been the not altogether unsuitable representative of the sex. They were her countrywomen, and the beef and ale of their native land, with a moral diet not a whit more refined, entered largely into their composition. The bright morning sun, therefore, shone on the broad shoulders and well-developed bust, and on the round and ruddy cheeks that had ripened in the far-off island, had hardly yet grown paler or thinner in the atmosphere of New England. There was, moreover, a boldness and rotundity of speech among these matrons, as most of them seemed to be, that would startle us at the present day, whether in respect to its purport or its volume of tone. "Good wives," said a hard-featured dame of 50, "I'll tell you a piece of my mind. It would be greatly for the public behoof if we women, being the mature age, and the church members in the good repute, should have the handling of such malefactresses as this Esther Prynne. What think ye, gossips? If a hussy stood up for judgment before us 5, that are now here and not together, would she come off with such a sentence as the worshipful magistrates have awarded? Marry, I trow not." "People say," said another, "that the Reverend Master Dimmesdale, her godly pastor, takes it very graciously to heart that such a scandal such have come upon his congregation." "The magistrates are good-fearing gentlemen, but merciful overmuch, that is the truth," added a third autonomal matron. "At the very least, they should have put a brand of a hot iron on Esther Prynne's forehead. Madam Esther would have winced at that, I warrant me, but she, the naughty baggage, little will she care what they put upon the bodice of her gown. Why, look you, she may cover it with a brooch or such a heathenish adornment, and so walk the streets as brave as ever. Ah, but, interposed more softly a young wife, holding a child by the hand, let her cover the mark as she will, the pang of it will always be in her heart. What do we talk of marks and brands, whether on the bodice of her gown or the flesh of her forehead? Cried another female, the ugliest as well as the most pitiless of the self-constituted judges. This woman has brought shame upon us all, and ought to die. Is there no law for it? Truly there is, but in the Scripture and the statute book. Then let the magistrates, who have made it of no effect, thank themselves if their own wives and daughters go astray. Mercy on us, good wife, exclaimed a man in the crowd. Is there no virtue in women, save what springs of the wholesome fear of the gallows? That is the hardest word yet. Hush now, gossips, for the lock is turning the prison door, and here comes Mistress Prynne herself. The door of the jail flung open. From within, there appeared, in the first place, like a black shadow emerging into sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle, with a sword by his side, and his staff of office in his hand. This personage prefigured the represented in his aspect the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law, which it was his business to administer in its final and closest application to the offender. Stretching forth the official staff in his left hand, he laid his right upon the shoulder of a young woman, who he thus drew forward, until on the threshold of the prison door she repelled him, by an action marked with dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air as if by her own free will. She bore in her arms a baby of some 3 months old, who winked and turned aside its little face from too vivid light of day, because its existence heretofore had brought it acquainted only with the grey twilight of a dungeon and other darksome apartment of the prison. When the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom, not so much by impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal a certain token which was wrought and fastened to her dress. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide the other, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet haughty smile, and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, covered with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of a last fitting decoration to the appeal which she wore, and which was of a splendor, in accordance with taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance and a large scale. She had dark and abundant hair, so glossy that it threw off the sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She was ladylike, too, after the manner of the feminine gentility of those days, characterized by the certain state and dignity rather than as its indication. And never had Esther Prynne appeared more ladylike, in the antique interpretation of the term, than as she issued from by the prison. Those who had before known her, and had expected to behold her dimmed and obscured by the disastrous cloud, were astonished and even startled to perceive how her beauty shone out, and made a halo of the misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. It may be true that to a sensitive observer there was something exquisitely painful in it. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought for the occasion in prison, and had modelled much after her own fancy, seemed to express the attitude of her spirit, the desperate recklessness of her mood, by its wild and picturesque peculiarity. But the point which drew all eyes, and as it were transfigured the wearer, so that both men and women had been familiarly acquainted with Esther Prynne, were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time, was that scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity, and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. She hath good skill at her needle, that's certain, remarked one of the female spectators. But did ever a woman before this brazen hussy contrive such a way of showing it? Why, gossips, what is it but to laugh in the faces of other godly magistrates, and make a pride out of what they, worthy gentlemen, meant for a punishment? It were well, muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, if we stripped Esther Prynne's rich gown off her dainty shoulders, and as for the red letter, which she hath stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of my own rheumatic flannel, and make it a fitter one. "Oh, peace, neighbors, peace," whispered their youngest companion. "Do not let her hear you. Not a stitch in that embroidered letter but she has felt it in her heart." The grim beadle now made a gesture with his staff. "Make way, good people, make way, in the king's name," cried he. "Open a passage, and I promise ye Mistress Prynne shall be set where man, woman, and child may have a fair sight of her brave apparel, from this time till an hour past Meriden. A blessing on the righteous colony of Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged out into the sunshine. Come along, Madam Esther, and show your scarlet letter in the marketplace." A lane was forthwith opened through the crowd of spectators, preceded by the beadle, and attended by the irregular procession of stern-browed men and unkindly-visaged women. Esther Prynne set forth towards the place appointed for her punishment. A crowd of eager and curious schoolboys, understanding little of the matter in hand, except that it gave them a half-holiday, ran before her in progress, turning their heads continually to stare into her face, and at the winking baby in her arms, and at the ignominious letter on her breast. It was no great distance in those days from the prison door to the marketplace. Measured by the prisoner's experience, however, it might be reckoned a journey of some length, for haughty as her demeanor was, she perchance underwent an agony from every footstep of those thronged to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them all to spurn and trample upon. In our nature, however, there is a provision alike marvelous and merciful, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what he endures by its present torture, but chiefly by the pang of the rankles after it. With almost a serene deportment, therefore, Esther Prynne passed through the portion of her ordeal, and came to a sort of scaffold at the western extremity of the marketplace. It stood nearly beneath the eaves of Boston's earliest church, and appeared to be a fixture there. In fact, the scaffold constituted a portion of the penal machine which now, for 2 or 3 generations past, has been merely historical and traditionary among us, but was held in the old time to be as effectual an agent in the promotion of good citizenship as ever was the guillotine among the terrorists of France. It was, in short, the platform of the pillory, and above it rose the framework of that instrument of discipline, so fashioned as to confine the human head in its tight grasp, and thus hold it up in the public gaze. The very ideal of ignominy was embodied and made manifest in the contrivance of wood and iron. There can be no outrage, methinks, against our common nature, whatever be the delinquencies of the individual, no outrage more flagrant than to forbid the culprit to hide his face for shame, as it was the essence of this punishment to do. In Esther Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence bore that she should stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing the gripe about the neck and the confinement of the head, the proneness in which was the most devilish characteristic of this ugly engine. Knowing well her part, she ascended the flight of wooden steps, and was thus displayed to the surrounding multitude at about the height of man's shoulders above the street. Had there been a Papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, with the infant at her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of the divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent. Something which should remind him, indeed, but only by contrast, of that sacred image of sinless motherhood, whose infant was to redeem the world. Here there was the taint of deepest sin in the most sacred quality of human life, working such effect that the world was only darker for this woman's beauty, and the more lost for the infant that she had borne. The scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as most always invest the spectacle of guilt and shame in the fellow creature. Before society shall have corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it, the witness of Hester Prynne's disgrace had not yet passed beyond their simplicity. They were stern enough to look upon her death, and that been the sentence, without a murmur at its severity, but had none of the heartlessness of social state which would find only a theme for jest in an exhibition like the present. Even had there been a disposition to turn the matter into ridicule, it must have been repressed and overpowered by the solemn presence of men no less dignified than the governor, and several of the councillors, a judge, a general, and the ministers of the town, all of whom sat or stood in a balcony of the meeting house looking down upon the platform. When such personages could constitute a part of the spectacle without risking the majesty of reverence of rank and office, it was safely to be inferred that the